January, I went to a chairs training conference and attended one session on decision making. And a professor who was an administrator at, I think, Brigham Young, he was presenting. He had been to a special seminar for university administrators at Harvard, where they, one of the professors there taught on decision making. And he gave us one assignment. We were in, it was this was a large attendance session, and he gave us an assignment. We worked in tables, round tables, and we were to choose what was the most important thing we should utilize from a list of about 8 items. We were supposed to choose what was the most important thing we'd use from about a list of 8 items, and about half of the groups of chairs and deans couldn't make up their mind. It was kind of funny. He would go and call on the tables, and they'd say, "We're not sure. Is this working?" Testing.
Got it. Oh, no.
Is it working? It is working. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Anyway, my interest in critical thinking came when I was an early professor here, and our chair of them was Jerome Boone. And they were, in the university, were emphasizing critical thinking some, which was a new concept to me of the way it was first being taught. And this is before we adopted this model. So I've been on the critical thinking task force since it started. So it was really probably a year before that. They were emphasizing the need to engage students, get them to think, and maybe more importantly, cover them some material. So I went and had a session with Jerome, and I said, "Do you think it's more important to do this than to cover material?" And he said, "There's certain material, of course, we have to cover." He said, yes, he believed that it was probably more important to help students learn how to think and learn for themselves than to cover everything we thought we ought to cover sometimes. That sometimes it may be good to cut back on your material to do this. That was a hard thing for me to do. Probably took me almost 3 years to get to where I could do that. Kept working on it each year, trying to get the balance. Still tweak things. But I consider this one of the most important things we did at the institution that I did not value early on, maybe not even fully when I was first on the task force. But after I worked with students and got reflecting on what it was like to be a business person, an educator, a pastor, I've pastored all these folks. About every discipline you can think of. I've worked with people in intimate aspects of their life. And I think probably the real goal of our education as people who've had doctorate training is to be better thinkers. So I bought into it after I got to really see what it was talking about. And now in ministry classes, I spend a lot of time trying to help our students think in better ways. And the students we deal with, you're going to find that some students are like some of the chairs were in the session I described. They have trouble making decisions. And then you're going to find some that are natural decision makers. It's almost intuitive for them. The one thing we want to emphasize, or I want to emphasize in this, is teaching this skill is not about whether to make a decision or not. It's about how to make better decisions through critical thinking. You study thinking and decision making, and some things are quite natural for making decisions. Some things are lower level. But the greater the challenge, the more we need to consider all factors, or multiple factors. And that's what Jerry's done an excellent job on laying out as one of the most difficult decisions anybody makes is how to decide if we take someone off life support. I've been with many families in this, and it's excruciating. I've been with people who do this with children up to very senior parents, and it's one of the most heart-rending things. I have a few emotional wounds still from helping somebody with a child on this issue, and I have been there myself, so I can identify with this being difficult decision making. In this one, what I'm going to do is focus on a class I teach that is called Ministry and Leadership. Leadership is a natural area for decision making. This is critical thinking skill number 5. Critical thinking skill number 5 does employ higher thinking critical skills. It's a model for deeper learning. This skill is not the best for the lower level classes in my estimation. It's not the best for a 100 level class, but it is possible to be taught in those kind of classes. Generally though, I think it really fits well with junior and senior classes. This is an overview of what I'm going to talk about. This is my model for teaching it in this class. I do not say this is the model you ought to use in every class. I talked about cutting out some material to fit this in a stronger way, but there are some classes that we teach that has information students must have that we may not be able to cut out. My wife's a social work professor at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and they have to fulfill certain requirements for licensing. And so they can't, those classes that provide those licensure information and material, they can't really cut that part out. So I understand that, but in this class, it lends itself for me being able to make a decision on how much I want to focus on this. So the first thing I do is I go through the syllabus on the first day. I introduce them to the concept of critical thinking as part of their class. I do not go over the decision-making skill number 5. Paperclip is a challenge. So then I do a pretest early in the semester, usually within a couple of weeks. That pretest would be to see how they do on a decision-making case study. So I can use it for comparison later. I still have not taught them skill number 5. Then I will, at some point after that, I introduce and explain critical thinking skill number 5, decision-making and problem solving. Then I will model this skill. I may take the pretest to model it at this point. And then I will present the rubric I'm going to use for their final exam, telling them as they learn critical thinking, I want them to recognize that they're going to seek to fulfill a rubric. And then throughout the class, we will have a range of exercises for groups and individuals in class and out of class for them to work on this decision-making, problem-solving skill. Sometimes I will develop exercises that relate to other course content, so that we'll incorporate another assignment possibly. I'll show you that as an illustration. And then they'll practice the skill with some feedback, meaning evaluation, grading. Sometimes we're doing it orally. It depends on the nature of the assignment. I'll give you a little overview of some of my ideas there. And I have a final exercise that is part of the final exam, or can be the entire final exam, where I will evaluate it and compare it with the pretest. So this is a syllabus overview. I tell them, I'm not going to read all this, but catalog description, I want them to know how critical thinking will develop, will relate to the course. This is number 6, behavioral objective, and it is where I'm put the critical thinking skill in the syllabus. Students will be able to utilize the critical thinking skill of decision-making and problem-solving in a administrative leadership context. You'll be doing something like that tomorrow on your syllabus. And under responsibilities of students, where they learn how they're going to get their grade, I put this one in this syllabus. Critical thinking exercises. Students will engage in critical thinking exercises throughout the class. Some exercises will be graded and may include writing assignments, reading responses in oral or written forms, and group work. And here I tell them the critical thinking exercises equal 20% of the overall grade. Okay? Now I'm going to give a final with this particular class that includes critical thinking. That final critical thinking assignment will count for 40% of this 20%. Okay, next strategy I do is pretest. It's where I give out a case study and have them to respond to it. I do not tell them about critical thinking skill number 5 at this point. I don't teach it. I tell them, though, it is an important assignment. I do not evaluate this in a typical way of grading for the overall grade, but on this one, I probably give them participatory credit. I try to emphasize it's important. I want them to resolve a case study and show their how they would make the decision. So I collect it, and then I'll probably talk about it with the class, but I'll save it for comparison with the final CT exercise. This is kind of a case study I might would employ for this first exercise. Your church is relocating from the outer city to a suburb of a metro area. You have a bus ministry for kids in the outer city area. Should you relocate this ministry to the suburb, discontinue it, or see if another church would like to assume the ministry? In this particular case study, I actually have been through this one before. We had a church that was in this exact situation, so I have some personal experience that I can incorporate into it after they've done it, and I want to debrief them. I can talk about the process we did. What's interesting is I didn't know about our model. This model we have for decision making wasn't even around back when we did this, but the processes you would engage in doing this, if you're involving a church in it, are very similar, where you're getting information gathering, looking at consequences, and coming to a decision. So it lends itself real good to this. Most of the time when I give this to students, a lot of students have not developed a model for decision making on their own, unless they've had another class that have done this. So a lot of the times you're getting kind of simplistic responses. You get some very good ones too that kind of have a lot of the elements, but maybe not all five. Okay, the third thing I do as part of my strategy is I introduce and explain the CT skill. I provide a handout or use some kind of media presentation. I will introduce them to the concept of critical thinking, what it's about. Jerry did a very fine job talking about how she emphasizes this with her class. And I'll do something similar, talking about how it relates to ministry leadership. I'll do something kind of interesting, Jerry. I'll actually talk about medical decisions in this intro a lot of times. And I'll say, isn't it good that in ministry we're not dealing with things that are that important? Most of the time the students will jump on me. And I'll say, then why don't we try to give our best to these kind of things in ministry too? We want our doctors to give their best. And I talk about Bloom's taxonomy. I give just a brief introduction to show how critical thinking works and the various components to it. I talk then about critical thinking at Lee University. Just an idea to introduce them to the idea that it's being taught all across campus. Most of them now know this by the time they're in a senior class. I will explain the CT skill number 5 like Jerry did, and I will probably go through it with a case study. I'll mention that. But I also want them to understand the applications for the course material. In your particular courses, the applications may be different, but you can see decision making / problem solving really relates to about any course to some degree. And the ones you choose to do it in, you'll probably find some really creative and original ways to apply it. Here's Bloom's taxonomy. I'll show something like this or this one. If you do want to show them Bloom's taxonomy, be aware there's more than one model of Bloom's taxonomy. So they create different orders. I found one that had the top 3 all on even plane, saying one was not superior to the other or in higher order. And Bloom even developed this model saying it's for my discipline, and I encourage other disciplines to develop their own. But this kind of became the standard. Even though some like other models, but of course this is just a model. I go over that with them. This is an abbreviated form, and then I model the skill. I actually may take the pretest and model it with pretest. This is what this one would do, or I may give another case study to model it. It just depends on how I'm tweaking it for the semester. Okay, so I'll go through that, talk about each one. Now, let me see. Then I'll present the rubric. If you would look, the rubric I use is in your handout. This is one I built on Rugastar.com. You can go in and build your own rubrics there. They have some templates, and you can adjust them. Then I blocked and pasted it to make some other adaptations in the before I gave it to students. So I'm not going to go over the rubric, but that's a 100-point rubric, and it's actually, you can see how that works in the syllabus handout I gave you. Well, not the syllabus handout, but in the, let's see if I gave that to you. Oh yeah, it's on the page before the rubric, if you look at that. there is a final exam case study response. That explains it, and it shows how I'm doing it and gives them the point back. Okay? So I'll go through this rubric. Now, I do this rubric early on because I want them to know as we're doing case studies, whether they're for grade or for learning, that each time we're building towards fulfillment of a rubric. That at the final, they will be expected to do this rubric and be able to get a good grade from it. That's the goal. And if they will learn and ask questions as we go, by the end, they should be able to do this. Now, what I find out is at the final is it's just like any other class. My better students usually will do this rubric very well, even if they did very poorly on the first decision-making case study that was a pretest. By the end, they'll do very well. But there's going to be some students that'll say, I'm cool with a B if I just do part of it, or a C. You know, and that's just the way it goes. But most of them will know at least a good part of this by the end of the class in this fall. Now, I will, at this point, practice with the students and give them feedback throughout the semester. I actually incorporate this throughout the semester, not every week, but with various class material. I actually have in this class a major class project. I will let them work on some decision-making models or some decision-making exercises with their major class project. Certain components of it I may pull out and say, today, use CT skill number 5 for this, and see if you can work on this in a group. I teach this skill to be used in a group context and an individual context. I want them to be able to know how to work in groups because most of their leadership in the future will involve other people in some kind of processes a lot of the time, but there's those times they're going to have to make decisions on their own too, even though that may include consulting. They are the decision makers. So I try to bring both of those in. I'll do clickers sometimes. Clickers are good for testing critical thinking skills, but for this actual model, I just use it to introduce it and see if they're learning the components of the model. I'll show you that just real quick. And yeah, in the handout I have some other case studies. So let me show you some iClicker stuff, just real quick. You remember doing this as a faculty? I do that to orient them to iClickers, you know, the clickers. Then I'll do this question. This is the 5 steps in a different order, and I ask them to identify step 1. Then I'll go through and do it for all the steps. That gets them ready if I want to put just these steps on the first exam. Actually, in this exercise, I did some other critical thinking exercises based off videos. I kind of got the idea there from Robert Fisher's presentation a few years ago, and Trevor Milline. I think both of y'all were doing clickers and had some ways of critical thinking. And so I got some ideas from both of them, and I developed that, but that's not part of CT skill number 5, the way I use that. So this is a case study where I may use it to introduce them to it. As a leader, you desire to develop the best possible leadership team, and just ask them to deal with the challenge of how to deal with the issue of a woman becoming part of the leadership team or desiring to. It's not packed, so they have to come out with a certain outcome, trying to give them a way to work with this, because we work with quite a diverse student body here, and some of them have different views of this, but it challenges them to work on this. And this one, I let them make bullet points rather than writing a narrative under each of the steps. And they can do that as a group. So that was one of my first exercises I do after I've been through all that stuff. You know. Then the final exercise is to evaluate. I went over that just briefly, but let me talk to you about one of these case studies right after, it's in your packet, it's right after the first handout. I want you to see this one because I do this one fairly early on also. It relates to their major project. In their major project in this class, they have to develop a ministry. They have to develop it in a group context. In this, I take the 5 steps, but I give them some clear guidelines. Like identify clearly the questions, problems. I say 3 minimum. Because some people will do 1 and just not do it. You know, generally I tell them 3 is enough too, so the overachievers can stop there. You need to remember, if you're doing a model like I do, Some of these you're only giving 15 or 20 minutes to, because you're wanting them to practice the skill, not master it in one session. So I'm one of these who values incremental learning, and so I may give them 20 minutes just to see if they can work the skills. Then later I'm going to give them one maybe for nearly a class period or a take-home. But in this one, on item 2, I note that I want them to get out of the box, but I say list 1 through 3 consequences for each of the questions in item 1. That tells them I don't need them to exhaust all the consequences. You can literally write a dissertation on one of these, on an issue like this. You know, it's almost endless the way you could explore it. So we're teaching a process for decision making. So I try to help them see how they can shorten this model to fit it into an exam time. That's what I'm trying to do. What are possible consequences? Then decide what your response will be and defend it. I tell them that will be that they will choose one of the items from above, and then I ask them to identify 3 questions that they must go to next. But in the exercise, if you do it open-ended, there are no limits to this on how many questions they might have at the end. So that's just my model. That's just a restatement of the skill. Any questions for me? Biggest thing I would encourage you to do if you do the skill is to see how it relates to your material, and see, think in terms of you can introduce them to the skill over a period of time. That's probably one of my contributions to this, and I actually embed it throughout the class on this particular class. I've done other skills where I did not do that, but on this one, that's how I do it. Thank you.